Picture this. I'm standing in a tiny hut on the edge of a frozen valley. The wind scratches at the walls like claws. The fire gasps for breath. My hands tremble as I press a glowing stone against my baby's chest, praying her skin won't turn blue before sunrise. Now, picture another world. Far to the south, beneath a sun that never sleeps, a queen walks barefoot across marble floors still warm from the desert heat. Her bracelets whisper when she moves. Servants lower their heads as she passes, though some dare to smile when she isn't looking. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. And yet, our survival depends on the same secret. Tonight, I want to show you how power moves quietly, how it hides not in crowns or armies, but in hands that remember warmth. We'll travel from the ashes of northern villages to the golden dust of forgotten kingdoms, to uncover why ancient Egyptian women were more powerful than you think. Good evening, traveler. Before we step any further, let the room fall quiet. Maybe you're listening from a narrow apartment where the city hums outside your window, or from a countryside kitchen that smells faintly of rain and wood smoke. Wherever you are, breathe slow. I always start my stories this way. I lower the lights, I listen for the soft tick of something living. A candle flame, a clock, my own pulse. It reminds me of the first hearth I ever tended, the one that cracked and hissed when frost crept too close. That sound, fire meeting cold, was the first lesson I ever learned about power. Not dominance, not control, preservation. If you wish, whisper, just softly, where you are listening from. It comforts me to imagine you out there somewhere, across centuries and miles, feeling the same small warmth in your chest. Because that's where every story like this begins. Not in palaces or temples, but in the quiet between breaths, where warmth means life and silence means death. Long before kings carved their names into marble, we carved hope into mud. Our valley, Valmir, sat at the northern edge of the world, or so it felt to us. From the ridges above, you could see nothing but frost and sky, the horizon blurring into a silver haze that never promised spring. We lived where the cold forgot to end. I was born in a season of wind. My mother said the storm had a voice that night, a long, hollow moan that circled the valley like a morning song. It frightened the cattle, but the elders took it as a blessing. The wind remembers your name, they told her. That means you will never be lost. In Valmir, everything had to mean something, or else the struggle would feel unbearable. Our houses were small, shaped from clay mixed with straw, their roofs stitched from reeds and wool. Inside, each wall bore the same marks, spirals, circles, and tiny runes carved by hand. We didn't have books then. We had symbols. The circle for warmth, the downward arrow for hunger, the spiral for time turning. Every household added its own mark after surviving another winter, a kind of signature carved in stubbornness. When the walls finally crumbled, people gathered the fragments and built them into new homes, so no life was ever truly erased. At dawn, smoke rose from every chimney like slender fingers reaching for the same prayer. The air smelled of ash, yeast, and animal fat. Children ran barefoot through the frost, chasing chickens, their laughter ringing like bright metal against the cold. The women, my mother among them, sang low as they stirred the day's first pot of stew, voices braided into one continuous rhythm. It wasn't music, not exactly. It was measurement, the tempo of survival. When one voice faltered, another carried the tune, as if sound itself could keep the frost from seeping in. We didn't measure time by calendars but by color. The white months meant endurance. The gray months meant waiting. The blue months, the coldest of all, meant prayer. And prayer in Valmir was never about mercy. It was about balance. Our goddess, Elandra, ruled both flame and frost. Her statues showed her with two faces, one calm, one seared by heat. Her myths warned us that fire could destroy as easily as it could save. Warmth is borrowed, the elders said, never owned. That phrase shaped everything, our justice, our love, our sense of power. Even children were taught to share the ember of their breath when another's fire failed. Each evening, before the sun vanished behind the glacier peaks, every household performed the same ritual. We called it the turning of the coal. A woman, usually the eldest or the wisest, would dig a glowing ember from the hearth, wrap it in ash, and bury it beneath a stone bowl. "Rest but do not fade," she whispered, the same words we used for the dying. At dawn, she would uncover it and breathe life back into the flame. In this way, yesterday's fire became tomorrow's beginning. I loved that rhythm, the sound of air feeding ember, the tiny sigh that followed. It was the sound of continuity, of hands remembering what time might forget. Sometimes I wonder if power begins there, in that motion, the act of keeping something alive that cannot live alone. We had no kings, no armies, no gold. Our leaders were chosen by memory. To be elder in Valmir meant you could recount every winter without confusing the faces of the lost. They gathered each new moon around the communal fire to recite the chain of names, a chant of everyone who had ever lived in the valley, in order. If you forgot one, you were replaced. Forgetfulness was our only crime. The people listened with reverence, though not all in stillness. The children would fall asleep curled against the dogs, the mothers mending clothes even as the stories flowed. Our history was never written, but it was memorized collectively, like a song everyone knew by heart. And so, when someone died, they weren't truly gone. Their name was folded into the rhythm, spoken aloud each winter until the valley itself seemed to hum with ghosts. Women, though they never called themselves such, were the keepers of that hum. We held the fires, brewed the medicines, tended the sick, told the stories that defined who we were. Power didn't have a gender here, it had a temperature. Those who could keep warmth alive held authority, no matter their sex. The old men carved tools, yes, but when the frost cut too deep and the animals starved, it was the women who decided which families would share food and which would move to higher ground. I remember watching my grandmother, Sarah, make those decisions. She was small, bent like a willow branch, but her eyes burned steady as coals. When a family begged for grain, she listened not to their words but to their breath. If their breath trembles, she said, they still have hope. Hope feeds itself. Give to the ones who no longer ask. It sounded cruel then. Now I think it was wisdom. She understood that mercy had to be measured like salt. Too little, and life turned bitter. Too much, and it spoiled everything. Our lives were harsh, yes, but they were coherent. We believed the world could be read if you watched closely enough. The direction of the smoke, the flight of the crows, the thickness of frost on the river stones. All these were letters in the same unspoken alphabet. When you learn to read the earth like that, you begin to feel safe, even in danger. You start believing there are no surprises left. That illusion held for generations. The frost came, the frost left. Babies were born, fires died, new ones were lit. The valley endured, small but unbroken. Some seasons were cruel, others kind, but always familiar. We trusted in repetition. We thought we understood the rhythm of the world. Until the night the rhythm failed. It began quietly. The air shifted, sharper, emptier. The birds vanished early that year, long before the sun dipped below the ridgeline. Hunters returned with hollow eyes, speaking of silent woods and rivers that tasted of metal. The elders frowned but said little. The frost is just impatient, they muttered. She'll come and go as she always does. But their words rang thin. Even the wind seemed to pause to listen. By the harvest moon, ice had crept into the shallows where fish usually spawned. The crops froze while still green. Grain cracked inside its husk like shattered glass. When the first snow came, it fell not as flakes but as ash, gray, fine, and dry, as though the clouds themselves had burned. We kept working, because work was what we knew. We built higher fires, gathered closer, told longer stories to outtalk the silence. But silence is patient. It waits until your voice falters, then takes the breath right out of your chest. That was the winter the rules change, the winter when warmth no longer obeyed us. I remember waking in the night to the sound of wood splitting, the hearth gasping out a single spark before collapsing into darkness. My daughter whimpered beside me. I pressed her tiny hand to my cheek, felt how quickly her heat was slipping away. I called for my mother, for Sarah, for anyone still awake, but all I heard was the wind, whispering through the gaps in the roof. Mine. In that moment, something inside me cracked too. Not from fear, but from the sudden knowledge that everything we believed about balance, about endurance, had been borrowed time. The frost was not a guest after all. It was the host, and we had been the intruders. By morning, half the valley's fires were dead. Smoke no longer rose to mark the living. The air tasted like metal, and the river groaned under ice that should not yet have formed. We gathered at the central square, wrapped in furs, eyes hollow, waiting for someone to speak sense into the chaos. But the elders stood silent. Even their memories, vast as they were, held no story for a winter like this. I looked at their faces, the same faces I had trusted all my life, and realized with quiet dread that the rhythm of the world had ended. What would come next had no pattern, no prayer, no name. And yet, even then, in that first stillness after the collapse, part of me felt something else. Not hope exactly, but attention, the awareness that we were being watched. By whom or what, I couldn't say. Only that the air seemed alive again, listening. If I had known what that meant, I might have prayed differently. I might have burned everything I owned just to keep the ember of my daughter's breath alive. But I didn't. None of us did. That night, for the first time in living memory, Valmir slept without fire. That winter came too soon. We said those words 100 times before they lost their meaning, but no phrase fit better. Everything about that season felt premature, unearned. The river froze before we'd finished grinding the last of the grain. The sun disappeared from the valley days before the solstice. The air itself grew heavier, sharper, as if something unseen had pressed down upon the earth and refused to lift its hand. We thought it was only weather. It was not. In those days, every family in Valmir kept a shared ember, a coal from the great hearth in the center of the village, a spark said to have burned since the founding of our people. When disaster struck, when fire failed, we relit our hearths from that same coal, trusting that its warmth carried memory. But now, even that ancient ember was faltering. The first to die were the smallest fires, the ones in huts furthest from the river, where the cold always arrived first. Then, one by one, the rest began to fade, each house going dark like a star winking out in the night. The silence that followed was unbearable. No dogs barking, no axes splitting wood, no human voice calling across the frost. Only the faint groan of ice as it spread across the valley floor, slow and deliberate, like glass growing over the world. By the fourth night, the frost had crept indoors. It formed white veins along the walls, laced our blankets, crystallized the edges of our breath. We tried to fight it as we always had, with work, with prayer, with stubbornness. My mother wrapped her hands around the last coal, whispering the old words of Elandra. When she opened her palms, the ember was dead. Something broke in her face then, not fear, not grief, but disbelief. She had spent 70 winters taming fire. To her, warmth was obedience rewarded. Now, it had betrayed her. The balance is gone, she murmured, as if speaking to herself. She's taken it back. We didn't know who she was. The goddess, the frost, the world itself. It didn't matter. The words felt true. That night, the villagers gathered in the square. The moon hung low and sharp, the snow reflecting its cold light until everything shimmered silver blue. The children huddled under furs. The elders stood with torches that burned weakly, the flames too pale to be trusted. Every few breaths, a torch would sputter and die. You could hear the collective gasp each time, like the valley itself was breathing with us. We need the old fire, someone said. I think it was Dahlin, the blacksmith. We need the ember from the founder's pit. So we went, a slow procession across the frozen ground, toward the mound at the river's bend where the first hearth had been built generations ago. The pit was half buried in ice now, its stones blackened, its ashes dusted white. The men cleared it, digging with numb hands until their skin split. Beneath the crust, the ashes still held faint heat, not enough to burn, but enough to remind us what we'd lost. "Blow on it," a voice said. It was a child's voice, thin but certain. We obeyed. One by one, we leaned in, exhaling into the pit, feeding it the only warmth left to us. The ashes stirred. A few sparks blinked red, too brief, too fragile, then vanished. The sound that followed was not human. It was the wind, but not the wind as we knew it. It rose from the mountains like a cry, deep and mournful, echoing through the frozen valley. Every head turned. Even the children stopped crying. The sound moved, circling us, pressing close, until I felt it tremble in my bones. That was when we saw him. A figure at the edge of the square, half hidden by drifting snow. Cloaked in black, face shadowed, yet somehow glowing, not with light but with temperature. The air around him shimmered faintly, as if the frost dared not touch him. No one spoke. We simply watched as he stepped forward, each footprint steaming against the ice. In his hands, he carried something small, a pouch, perhaps, or a bundle wrapped in cloth. When he reached the dead hearth, he knelt without a word. My mother clutched my arm. "Don't," she whispered. "He's no man." But I couldn't look away. The stranger untied the pouch and poured a handful of dust into his palm. It glowed faintly blue, brighter where the moonlight touched it. Then, with the same calm precision as a craftsman at work, he cast the dust into the ashes. The fire did not return all at once. It began as a breath, a sigh that seemed to rise from beneath the earth, soft and deep. The ashes shifted, a faint thread of smoke coiled upward, and then, a roar. Flame leapt from the pit, fierce and alive, blue at the core, gold at the edges. The crowd staggered back. Heat struck my face like a physical blow. For the first time in weeks, I could smell warmth, resin, smoke, life. The stranger stood. The firelight caught his eyes, and I saw that they were not brown or gray but ember red, glowing as if lit from within. He looked at us, at me, and spoke just one sentence. "Your warmth was never yours." Then he turned and walked away. No one tried to stop him. We watched his shape grow smaller, swallowed by the snow, leaving behind a trail of melted footprints that hissed and smoked until they vanished. By dawn, there was no sign he had ever been there. But the fire remained. We carried coals from that pit back to our homes, wrapping them in clay jars, whispering thanks to whichever god had heard us. By morning, the valley glowed again, not with the pale light of frost, but with the orange pulse of hundreds of hearths reborn. Children laughed. Old men wept. The dogs howled as if trying to sing. For a moment, it felt like victory, like resurrection. But beneath the joy, something uneasy stirred. The fire burned too bright, too hungry. The ashes crackled with a sound that reminded me of breathing. When I slept that night, I dreamed of the stranger's eyes, and of the words he left behind. "Your warmth was never yours." I woke sweating, though the air was cold enough to frost my hair. The hearth beside me pulsed faintly blue, like a living heart. By the next morning, people had begun to whisper. They said the stranger was Elandra's messenger, or perhaps Elandra herself in mortal form. Others swore he was a spirit of the old frost, tricking us into burning too fast. The priests offered no answer. They simply bowed before the new flames and called them holy. Soon, every home performed a new ritual. Each night, before burying their coal in ash, families added a pinch of salt or blood or bone dust, a gift for the spirit who had revived the fires. No one could agree on what the offering meant. Some said it fed the warmth. Others said it bound it. I kept mine simple. I whispered my daughter's name into the flame and watched it flicker in response, as if acknowledging the sound. The fire seemed to listen now, to pulse when we spoke, to glow brighter when someone entered the room. It was as if it knew us, recognized us. For the first time, I understood fear not as cold but as heat. Because when something burns this brightly, it is only a matter of time before it consumes its keeper. Still, we could not turn away. Warmth had become our god again, living, breathing, insatiable. The elders declared that the old ways must be rewritten, that new songs must be composed to honor the rebirth. We obeyed. We sang, we praised, we built altars around our hearths. But when I looked into the flames, I no longer saw salvation. I saw eyes, ember red, unblinking, watching from within. And in their reflection, I saw the truth the stranger had tried to tell us. We had never mastered the fire. It had merely been waiting for its chance to master us. After the stranger vanished and the flames returned, we did what people always do when terror recedes. We tried to make sense of the miracle until it behaved like work. At first, we copied what our mothers had taught us. Each night, we buried a coal in ash and whispered, "Rest but do not fade." But the new fire felt different, quick, blue-hearted, eager to climb. It wanted air, and it punished carelessness. A hut that once needed 3 logs now demanded 5. A hearth that once slumbered through the night woke hungry at dawn. We learned fast or we wasted wood. I began keeping notes the way a healer tracks fevers. Not on parchment. We had none to spare, but on the baked inner wall beside my hearth. I scratched lines with a charred stick, marking which woods burned steady, which flared and failed, which smoked the room and made the children cough. Dry alder held a calm orange. Birch burned bright and brief. Pine lied. It promised heat, then left a cold that felt personal. I tried mixing them, 3 parts alder, 1 part birch, a fist of pine to start the breath. The flames responded like a body to medicine. Others started doing the same. Our walls became ledgers. Our ledgers became a language. Soon, patterns emerged. Fires lived longer when we banked them wide instead of deep. Hearths with a low stone lip drank air too greedily. Those with a narrow throat starved. A child discovered that 2 flat stones, spaced a thumb apart, pulled smoke up and invited clean air in. So he carved throats into our hearths and called them mouths. An old man remembered the clay vents of his father's kiln. We stole the idea shamelessly and opened ribs, small side channels that fed the flame without fanning it wild. No one said, "Draft," or "flow." We said breath. It made more sense to our hands. The priests tried to name it magic. The elders called it blessing. I called it attention. The fire noticed us and we learned to notice back. But notice alone wouldn't save a valley. The winter was still wrong. The woods were thinning. The river groaned under a lid of ice we had never seen hold so long. If each household burned what it pleased, we would eat our forests to the roots before spring. So we did the next hard thing. We made a system. We chose 6 families, 3 close to the river, 3 toward the ridge, and bound them by oath to carry warmth when others' fires failed. We called them ashkeepers. The name was older than I was. It had meant memory once. Now it meant logistics. An ashkeeper's home became a bank of heat. Each tended 2 hearths, 1 for living, 1 for lending. The lending hearth burned low and disciplined, fed by alder and guarded like a newborn. Each dawn, the keepers baked small clay jars the size of a palm, filled them with coals, sealed them with damp ash, and scored a spiral on the lid. The spiral was our oldest mark for time turning. It also kept thieves honest. A broken spiral told on a broken oath. We decided, together, that a loaned coal would cost something, not in coin, which we did not use, but in weight. Whoever took a jar returned a stick bundle marked by notches. 1 for dry wood, 2 for split wood, 3 if the wood had been carried from the ridge. The notches were counted at dusk, not by priests but by widows. Widows had nothing to gain from lies and everything to gain from heat. Hoarders learned that shame burns hotter than pine. Rules spread like songs. A coal could not travel more than 3 doors without rest. Children could carry but not open. If a jar cooled on the road, its carrier warmed it under clothes and counted those heartbeats as a blessing. People began to boast softly of their counts. I kept 6 heartbeats alive today. No one laughed. We had started to speak fire in numbers without saying the word. To prevent panic, we mapped our need. Not on hide, but in footsteps and pebbles. Every lane had a line of stones outside each door. Each evening, a family placed 1 white pebble if their fire was strong, 1 gray if it faltered, 1 black if it died. At dawn, ashkeepers walked the lanes with baskets and read the valley as a ledger. White for surplus, gray for attention, black for urgency. It turned out that power looks like this: waking earlier than everyone else and carrying baskets until your shoulders burn. Women led by default, as we had always led the heat. We trained the children in breath patterns the way others teach letters. In through the nose, hum, out through the mouth, slow, like singing to a sleeper who refuses to wake. We learned that a steady hum helped a buried coal survive the cold shock of night. The vibration tickled it back from the edge. The little ones called it tickling Elandra. Their laughter helped more than any charm. Superstition braided itself through the work because the work was hard and the unknown lived next door to every answer. Some families salted their ash. Some pinned a hair ribbon above the hearth to tie the flame. A shepherd swore that sprinkling ground bones steadied the burn. I tested it and found it only colored the smoke. I let the rumor live. Hope steadies people, even when bone does not steady fire. Still, we measured what hope tried to hide. We learned that jarred embers kept heat longer when the clay was tempered with crushed shell. We learned the mouth of a hearth performed best at 2 hands wide. 1.5 starved, 3 gulped. We learned that stacking wood loose inside the hut dried it better than stacking neat outside. Order comforts the eye, not the ember. We learned that if we woke each night at the river's hour, the darkest slice before dawn, we could save what would be impossible to revive by morning. The river's hour became our alarm and our liturgy. As the system tightened, so did our lives. We limited feasts, forbade waste, banned the old game where boys threw resin bundles into the flames to make them jump blue. We kept the blue for memory. A pinch of the stranger's dust, divided and divided until it was mostly story. We said we were conserving it for births and deaths. We were conserving it for fear. Power shifted in quiet ways. Men who had once measured worth by antlers and pelts now judged themselves by cords of wood stacked straight through to spring. A generous stack became a dowry. A steady hearth became a proposal. Girls asked suitors, not, "How fast can you run?" but, "How long can you keep the ember breathing?" The answers were rarely boasts. The new pride wore humility like a glove. And because systems breed incentives whether you invite them or not, some found angles. One keeper hoarded clay and charged extra for jars that held a blessing longer. A woodcutter soaked logs to add weight to the notches. A widow swapped black pebbles for gray on nights she feared shame more than cold. We corrected gently at first, then with teeth. The keepers met each 7th night at the founder's pit and settled debts the old way. Not by blade or chain, but by solitude. A cheat tended the lending hearth alone for a moon, sleeping by it on stone, eating after others, speaking only to flames. Most returned quieter, steadier. Some left for the ridge and did not come back. When the first hut burned, we almost broke the whole machine. It belonged to Ira, whose laugh could melt ice. He had banked his fire too hot and too proud. The roof lifted in a single bright sigh and fell in sparks. For a week after, people buried their coals so deep they died. Fear swings the pendulum as wildly as pride. We steadied the rules again. No banking high. No sleeping near uncovered flame. No singing loud during the river's hour lest the hum turn to hunger. Through it all, the stranger's sentence worked on me like a splinter. Your warmth was never yours. I disagreed in the morning and believed him at night. The data on my wall, though I never used that word, suggested both things at once. We could shape the breath of fire, but not own its will. I started teaching a phrase to anyone who asked what I was learning. We tend the cause, not the outcome. People repeated it as if it were prayer. It calmed hands and tamed woodpiles. By midwinter, the valley survived on this mesh of oaths, jars, pebbles, hums, and habits. We had turned fear into protocol. When a baby was born, the midwife touched its lips with warm spoon and counted to 5. When an elder died, we pressed a coal to the doorframe so the house would remember to breathe after grief. We built a public warming wall from river stones that held daylight and released it slow. At dusk, the old and the ill sat with their backs against it, silent as cats. Traders passed through even in that cruel season, drawn by the rumor of a valley that had tamed blue fire. They watched us pass jars and count pebbles and hum to ash. They laughed first, then they asked to buy the jars, then the songs. We gave them neither. We did trade them a habit, a small wooden tally marked with a spiral on one side and a mouth on the other. Spiral up, you owe heat. Mouth up, you owe wood. They liked the logic. Logic spreads faster than myth. One trader lingered, soft-eyed, sharp. She asked not for what we made but for how we decided. Who chooses, she said, when a house must give up its coal? I told her the truth. The widows at dusk. She smiled, as if the answer confirmed a map she carried in her bones. Where I am going, she said, women keep a different fire. They measure power by who can turn heat into food, breath into law. She meant the South. I felt sand in her voice. When she left, she took a single idea with her like a glowing seed. That warmth is a commons, not a trophy. I did not know then how far that seed would travel. I only knew our own house was holding steady, mouth 2 hands wide, ribs clear, ash salted not for magic but for dryness, jar lids scored true, breath hum soft and slow. Survival, it turned out, was a choir sung in small, relentless notes. The choir changed us. We became quieter, more exact. We wasted less and watched more. Power, such as it was, moved into the hands that showed up before dawn with baskets and came home after dark with soot on their teeth. People began to say, with a pride that felt like modesty, I keep the 10th house warm. Not ruler, not hero, keeper. I thought the system would be the end of the story, the part where we tame the fear and return to rhythm. It was not. Systems, like fires, create their own weather. Ours would send smoke down the valley and over the mountains, into places where marble remembered heat and queens walked barefoot. And someone from our choir, someone small enough to pass unseen and stubborn enough to carry a jar across a desert, would one day teach a palace how to breathe. But before that, we still had a winter to finish, and a debt to pay to the blue at the heart of our flames. I suppose every system eventually needs a face. Ours found one in Mira, the healer, the ashkeeper, the woman who spoke to fire as if it were her equal. I knew her long before the stranger came, back when she was only a girl who collected pine resin in her skirts and fed stray dogs from her bowl. She had a voice that could hush quarrels without raising itself. When she laughed, even the crows on the ridge tilted their heads, curious. People said the frost avoided her door. When the new blue fire arrived, Mira was the first to treat it like a patient instead of a miracle. She watched it, measured it, named its moods. If the flames snapped, she said they were angry. If they hummed, they were dreaming. If they burned silent and blue, they were remembering. Her house became a clinic for warmth itself. Villagers brought their failing coals like wounded birds. You breathe wrong, she told them. You fear it, fire knows. And then she'd kneel by the hearth, stroke the ash with her bare hands, and whisper until the flame blushed orange again. No one could explain it, but no one wanted to. The priests disliked her. They said the goddess Elandra worked through ritual, not through women who disobeyed the temple schedule. But the villagers trusted results more than titles. When babies stopped coughing after sleeping by Myra's hearth, when frostbite healed under her poultices of melted ash, even the priests came to her door at night with their sick. I visited often, partly out of admiration, partly out of unease. Her hut smelled of resin and crushed herbs, the air thick and steady, warm enough to make you forget winter existed beyond the threshold. The walls were covered in her markings, circles intersected by spirals, small notches counting the days since the stranger's visit. She told me she was studying the fire's memory. Every ember keeps a story, she said. You just have to ask before it cools. When I laughed, she didn't. Mira, I said, you talk as though it listens. It does, she replied. You just don't listen back. Her faith wasn't the loud kind. It was patient, observational, the faith of someone who's learned that miracles have habits if you watch long enough. She taught the younger ashkeepers her rules. Never bank a coal while angry. Never speak cruelly near the fire. Never turn your back on a dying ember without saying thank you. The others obeyed without argument. Under her guidance, the network of ashkeepers grew tighter, more deliberate. We began trading not just heat but knowledge. Diagrams scratched into bark, coded songs teaching airflow, even small experiments testing how different woods carried sound through flame. Mira called it listening to the hearth's breath. I didn't know it then, but she was laying the foundation for something larger than survival, a language of energy and care that would outlive all of us. Yet even the wise make bargains with exhaustion. That winter, a fever swept through Valmir. It came not from hunger or cold, but from the smoke. The blue flames we praised so fiercely filled our huts with strange fumes. People began coughing blood, their eyes rimmed in soot. We didn't know whether to pray or smother our fires. Mira refused to let them die. She claimed the fire was changing, purging something in us, not poisoning us. She brewed potions of honey and melted snow, laced them with ground charcoal, and told us to breathe slow. Some healed, others didn't. When my own mother fell ill, I carried her to Myra's hut. Mira met me at the door, her face streaked with ash. She's cold inside, she said after one glance. Then give her heat. Mira shook her head. Too much will crack her. For 3 nights, we stayed there, my mother half awake, whispering the names of lost winters. Mira fed her sips of fire-warmed water, tracing spirals on her palms. On the 4th morning, my mother stopped breathing. Mira placed a coal in her hands and said softly, "The frost has claimed what was hers." Then she looked at me. "Keep the rest alive." That was the day I stopped doubting her. From then on, she became more than healer. She was prophecy. The one who could bargain with elements, who could walk through smoke without coughing. People began leaving offerings outside her hut. Bits of salt, carved spirals, feathers of black birds. She told them not to, but humans cannot resist building temples around competence. Her power frightened the priests. They said no woman should speak directly to the flame, that the stranger's gift was being twisted. Mira ignored them. She said warmth belonged to everyone, not to those who feared it most. Then came the long night, the coldest any of us remembered. It began with a sound like glass breaking in the sky. The wind shifted east, the snow turned to shards. Even the blue flames struggled, shrinking back as if remembering their place. People stayed inside, whispering Myra's name like prayer. I went to her hut near midnight, carrying my daughter wrapped in fur. She had been born weak that autumn, lungs too small for our sharp air. I found Mira kneeling by her hearth, the fire burning low and sickly blue. "Please," I said, "she's fading." Mira took her from my arms, pressed a glowing stone to the baby's chest, a stone she kept buried in her oven for such nights. The baby gasped once, twice, and color returned to her lips. "She'll live," Mira said, "if you remember this. Never let your warmth depend on anyone's permission." She handed the child back and smiled, though her eyes looked strange, hollow and bright all at once. "Go home," she said. "Your hearth needs you more than I do." At dawn, the sky glowed the color of iron. Smoke rose from every chimney except hers. By midday, we saw the flames. Myra's hut burned clean and fast, a pillar of blue and gold. The wind carried sparks like tiny spirits fleeing the blaze. We tried to reach her, but the heat drove us back. When the fire finally collapsed into ash, there was nothing left but her stone bowl and a single spiral etched deep into the ground. The priests called it judgment. The elders called it sacrifice. I called it inheritance, because that night, every hearth in Valmir burned steady without tending. The fire no longer needed watching. It had learned the rhythm of our breath, or maybe we had learned its. Either way, we survived the winter. Myra's daughter, Liana, grew among us for a few short years, wild, quiet, curious. She carried her mother's gray eyes, the color of ash after flame. Then traders came from the south, bringing salt and silk and stories of cities where warmth was a constant thing. Liana left with them, too young to understand what she was carrying, the discipline of fire disguised as faith. I like to think Mira planned it that way. She always said the world needed its warmth scattered, not stored. When the last snow melted, I went to the ruins of her hut. Beneath the blackened stones, I found her old clay jar, unbroken. Inside was a single coal, cold but whole. I sealed it again, marked the lid with a spiral, and buried it by the river. Some nights, when the frost returns and the valley sleeps, I can still hear it hum, a quiet sound, like breathing. That's how I know she's not gone. She just moved her fire elsewhere. I still remember the day Liana left Valmir. The thaw had just begun, cautious, uncertain, as if the frost itself were reluctant to loosen its grip. The river cracked open in long, groaning sighs. The air smelled of iron and wet clay. Traders had come early that year, their carts piled high with salt and fabrics bright enough to hurt the eyes after months of white. Liana stood among them, her small hands gripping a leather strap, her gray eyes fixed not on the horizon but on the fire pit we had built for her farewell. She said nothing. Words were always a colder thing than warmth, and she had inherited her mother's silence. When the wind lifted her hair, I caught a glimpse of something bright woven into it, a thread of golden fiber, gifted by one of the traders. It glowed like trapped sunlight. We gave her the old blessing: carry what burns, leave what breaks. She nodded once, then turned south. None of us expected to see her again. For weeks after she left, the valley felt smaller. Our systems still worked, the jars, the pebbles, the breath patterns, but something invisible had gone missing, some melody beneath the rhythm. The priests declared a feast of renewal, the rest of us kept working. Spring came. The frost retreated to the mountains, leaving us with mud, green shoots, and questions that refused to die. Years passed. Stories drifted back with the traders. A girl with gray eyes had been seen near the border towns, fixing stoves for a handful of grain, teaching the poor to build clay chimneys that breathed like lungs. She moved from village to village, leaving behind warmth that lasted through the night. No one knew her name. Some called her the Ember Child. Others, the Northern Ghost. I didn't hear her name spoken again until a merchant caravan brought word from the desert empire of Saethem. They said a servant girl in the royal kitchens had built a stove that needed no wood, only sunlight trapped in black stones. They said her fires burned steady even after sunset. They said the queen herself had summoned her to the palace, not to punish but to learn. And when they asked her where she had learned such craft, she answered, from a woman who listened to fire. That was how Liana entered history, not through conquest or birthright, but through a rumor that refused to cool. Saethem was nothing like Valmir. I know this because I went there once, long after the worst winters had passed, to see what had become of her. Even now, decades later, the memory of that journey burns like sunlight behind my eyelids. The land changed color as I traveled, from gray to brown, brown to gold. The air itself grew lighter, hungrier. The rivers shrank to trickles, then vanished altogether. The mountains of my home dissolved into dunes. And there, at the center of all that emptiness, Saethem rose like a dream carved from light. Its walls were the color of old honey. The streets smelled of spice and sweat. Water flowed through stone channels, singing softly to itself. I had never seen so much color. Silk banners of crimson and turquoise fluttering above markets. Women with painted eyes carrying baskets of fruit that glowed like jewels. Yet what struck me most was not the abundance, but the heat. It pressed from every direction, thick and constant, as if the sun itself had made a home there. In Valmir, we worshipped warmth because it was rare. In Saethem, they feared it because it never left. When I first saw Liana, I almost didn't recognize her. She stood in the courtyard of the palace, surrounded by servants who moved like water around her. She wore linen instead of wool, gold dust instead of ash. But her eyes were the same, gray and steady, like cloudlight before snow. She smiled when she saw me. "You came," she said, as if she had been expecting me all along. "I had to see if the stories were true," I told her. "They say you've tamed the sun." She laughed, softly, carefully. "No one tames the sun. I only taught it manners." Her new world was a world of opposites. Where we had frost, they had flame. Where we rationed fire, they rationed shade. The palace roofs were painted white to reflect heat. Water was stored underground in clay cisterns cooled by air channels. Everything was designed to survive abundance. And yet, for all their wealth, their systems were fragile. Their fires consumed too quickly, their forges cracked in midday heat, their healers used water faster than it could be carried from the wells. They needed a new way to think about warmth, not as a burden or a punishment, but as a balance. That was the gift Liana carried from the north, the discipline of temperature as mercy. She began as a servant in the royal kitchens, where the air shimmered with heat and the smell of bread mixed with smoke. She watched how the cooks fanned the flames, wasteful, impatient, and built small clay chimneys that breathed like the hearths of Valmir. When the cooks laughed, she said nothing. When the first oven baked twice as much bread with half the fuel, they stopped laughing. The queen noticed. Queen Saethem was unlike any ruler I had ever imagined. She walked barefoot through marble halls, her ankles painted with protective sigils, her hair unbound in defiance of tradition. The priests whispered that she was reckless. The people whispered that she was kind. When she summoned Liana, it wasn't to command, but to ask. "Show me," she said. And Liana did. She taught the queen how to read the air currents in a room by watching the sway of a candle's flame. How to shape clay into breath channels that cooled without extinguishing. How to bury coals in ash to store heat for nightfall. The queen listened like a student, not a sovereign. They became inseparable, the servant and the queen, two halves of the same equation. In Saethem, it was said that Saethem ruled the day and Liana ruled the hours between dusk and dawn. The court called her the keeper of breath. But power, even shared gently, attracts envy. The priests grew restless. They accused Liana of sorcery, of binding spirits in stone. They said the cool air in the queen's chambers was stolen from the underworld, that the northern girl was tempting death itself. The queen defended her at first. "You mistake knowledge for magic," she told them. "The gods gave us minds so that we could learn the laws of their gifts." But the whispers spread. The nobles muttered that Liana was not teaching balance, she was teaching rebellion. Because what frightened them most was not the science, but the simplicity. If a servant could control the heat of a palace with clay and patience, what else might servants learn to control? I stayed in Saethem for a year, watching her work. She never sought credit. She moved among the workers, correcting their posture, adjusting their breathing. She built what she called shade gardens, courtyards lined with dark stone that absorbed the sun by day and released cool air by night. She replaced the palace lamps with mirrored bowls that multiplied a single flame into 20 without burning extra oil. Each invention was small, practical, gentle, and revolutionary. She told me once, the South thinks of power as fire that must be fed. The North thinks of it as fire that must be hidden. But both forget the real secret. Fire is just the conversation between breath and matter. The question is who listens longer. I asked her if she ever missed Valmir. "Sometimes," she said, "when the nights here are too warm. But the frost still lives in me. I carry its discipline." Before I left, she pressed a small clay jar into my hands. The lid was marked with our old spiral. "There's no coal inside," she said. "Only air. But if you breathe into it before dawn, it will remember you." I didn't understand then, but I kept it. Even now, years later, I open it sometimes and swear the air inside feels younger, as if it's been waiting to be used. By the time I returned north, Saethem was changing. The queen had ordered new laws for workers, new structures for the city's hearths. The priests were losing influence. Women in the market spoke of the breath doctrine, a set of simple teachings about balance, patience, and shared warmth. They said it came from the north, from a valley that lived through eternal frost. I realized then that what had begun as survival in Valmir had become philosophy in Saethem. The discipline of warmth had crossed the mountains, translated itself into a new language, one of sunlight and shadow, of rulers and servants learning to breathe the same air. When I reached home, I told the story to my apprentices. They listened wide-eyed, imagining deserts that shimmered and queens who walked barefoot on marble. I told them this much was true: our fire was never just ours. It was a lesson, and lessons are migratory things. Some nights, when the valley goes quiet and the stars hang low, I swear I can see a faint orange glow on the southern horizon, too far for campfires, too steady for lightning. I like to believe that's Saethem, still burning, still listening. Myra's voice carried there through her daughter, and her daughter's voice will carry beyond. And the world, colder or hotter, rich or poor, will keep learning the same rule, over and over. Warmth shared is never lost. It only changes accent. Power doesn't explode here. It thins. It cools at the edges, retreats from the places that once warmed you. By the time you notice, the room is already colder. It began the day the queen chose to love in public. His name was Arian. He was king in title and hostage in practice, a monarch threaded through with compromises older than his bones. Saethem was ruled by bargains more than by men. The priesthood held the calendars, the nobles held the granaries, the guilds held the tools, the water-bearers held the city's throat. Arian learned to smile as he yielded, and to yield as if he were smiling. Liana never asked him for anything. That was part of the danger. They met in the kiln court, where she was teaching apprentices to shape the new breath channels. The kiln's mouth glowed like a setting sun. He stood in the shadow, unguarded for once, watching a girl from the clay quarter spin a coil as straight as a vow. Liana looked up, not startled, not deferential, only measuring him the way she measured a draft. Where he pulled, where he pushed, where he might make smoke. Later, in the gardens, I saw them walking, barefoot both, as if rank were a pair of sandals they had agreed to set aside for an hour. He told her stories of boyhood, sneaking to the river tunnels, daring the cool air to lift the hair on his arms, counting the breaths between a torch's flickers until the priest found him and cuffed his ear. She told him the single story she always told, in variations: warmth is borrowed. Keep it moving. He fell, not like a stone, but like light sliding down a wall toward evening. When he married her, he broke nothing written. Saethem's laws did not forbid a king to choose a queen from the kitchens. Old inscriptions praised rulers who took wisdom where they found it. But you know this already. Collapse begins not where laws are absent, but where incentives gather. The priests lost offerings the day the palace learned to keep rooms cool without their incense. The water-bearers lost coin when shade gardens lowered thirst. The bronze smiths lost orders when mirrored bowls replaced dozens of oil lamps. Nobles lost leverage when workers slept better and missed fewer days for heat sickness. Even the gossip wives who sold rumors for sugared figs found their trade cramped by Liana's dull refusal to court scandal. The city's economy had been built around managed discomfort. She had made comfort efficient. Not villains, systems. What angered them most was the ease. Her answers used clay, breath, patience, the wide currencies any servant could afford. If the queen herself knelt beside a brazier to adjust the mouth 2 fingers narrower, what noble could claim his fingers sacred? If the king sat at supper under one flame multiplied into 20 by polished mirrors, what merchant could insist the old waste was necessary? Every new habit she taught rode a small private rebellion into the hands of those who had never owned a law. So they found a story older than fact and sharper than hunger. They called her Maris born. You've heard the whispers, perhaps, or their cousins in other ages. Maris, the desert city that vanished. Maris, where women were said to rule by silence and mirrors. Maris, where the dead were burned to cool the living. No inscription proves any of this, which is why it survives so well. Rumor prefers empty stone. They said Liana had resurrected the servants' queen's cult. That her shade gardens trapped souls, that the black stones lining them were bone. That the coolness in the royal chambers was an underworld wind. That the spiral she carved on every jar lid was not our northern mark of turning time but a sigil to bind obedient spirits. They said the breath doctrine was theft from the gods. They never said it cleanly in public. They didn't need to. They let the stories circulate like warm air, through kitchens and courtyards, through the narrow stair where a girl carrying water learns what fear to keep and what to spill. Markets enforce what courts only pretend. Arian waited too long to answer. Love makes optimists of even the cautious. He believed that gratitude would outvote envy. He believed results were arguments. Fuller bread racks, cooler wards, fewer fevers. He forgot that when a system is threatened, it will prefer worse results that keep its old rewards. The first move came dressed as reverence. The high keeper of the Temple of Breath, the same man who had long mocked the phrase, proposed a festival of balance to honor Liana's work. Let us bind her knowledge into ritual, he said sweetly, so that it cannot be misused. People cheered. Honey always coats hooks. Binding meant measuring. Measuring meant licensing. Licensing meant gatekeeping. In one proclamation, the priesthood placed itself between Liana and her students, between clay and breath. A woman in the clay quarter now needed a seal to build a chimney that breathed, a tithe to teach the hum that soothed smoke, a priest to watch her shape a lamp bowl. What had flowed hand to hand began to clot at the temple's doors. She ignored the edict. Of course she did. Systems tighten and expect the world to stop breathing. Breath continues. Arian tried to bargain. He offered the priesthood new storerooms, new courtyards, even a slice of the harvest tax if they would release the licenses. They smiled. They had no interest in taxes. Control tastes sweeter. And then the city was given a small mercy wrapped as a disaster, a sandstorm. It came late in the season, after the palms had flowered, 3 days of blind grit and roofs shedding clay like old scabs. When the wind stilled, half the southern quarter woke coughing, their lamps choked, their ovens dead. Liana walked those lanes for a day and a night, clearing mouths, reopening ribs, teaching 100 times the same lesson with the patience of river stone. Someone followed her. Someone gathered ash from every hearth she touched. Someone laid the powder on the temple steps under the moon and said, "This is human." By dawn, the word had a smell. The priests stood in white, their faces clean, and held up a bowl of ash that glittered faintly. Bone, they announced, though bone glitters only in stories and on altars. They named no names. They didn't have to. Even those who loved Liana flinched. The human mind is generous with dread where the body has once been afraid to breathe. Saethem, the queen, summoned the council at once. She did not stand on ceremony. She entered barefoot, with dust still clinging to her ankles, and took the lowest seat. Arian sat beside her, his hand quiet on the armrest, the hand of a man learning how little a throne can hold. The nobles arranged themselves like knives. The guildmasters stacked their expressions like crates. The priests performed grief. I watched from the lattice above, the place where servants listen and turn history into rumor and rumor into future. I felt pity for all of us, for the men who believed the world must choose their comfort or its improvement, for the woman who had believed improvement could be offered without exacting anyone's price, for the king who thought loving publicly would be read as permission for the city to love as well. Not villains, systems. They called Liana in last. She wore simple linen, ash on her fingers, a faint scorch on her forearm where a child had stumbled into a brazier and she had lifted the iron without thinking. She looked tired and alive. The High Keeper spoke first, his voice smooth as cooled oil. "Keeper of Breath," he said, refusing her queen's title as if humility were a leash, "we honor your service. But there are whispers. The people are frightened. They say you call the dead into the houses of the living. They say your shade is not shade." Liana did not bow. "Fear grows well in places that sell it water," she said evenly. "What do you need to know?" He smiled with his whole face and none of his eyes. "Only that you did not use bone ash to steady your fires." She could have answered with defiance. She could have taught the room in 10 words what an hour of demonstration would prove. That bone ash hardens clay, yes, and whitens smoke a little, yes, and comforts fools, yes, but steadies nothing in flame except myth. She did not. She knew a trap when she saw one. "I used ash from the old fires," she said. "From the kitchens, from the ovens, from the braziers where mothers cook and smiths cure and midwives boil their cloth." "Mixed with what?" he pressed. "Breath," she said, and did not look away. "And patience," the nobles murmured. "Patience costs those who outsource their seasons." The priests changed tactics. "Then why the spiral?" one demanded. "Why mark each jar as if sealing a charm?" She smiled, and for a beat I heard Valmir in her mouth. "Because time turns. Because someone taught me not to trust memory without a mark." That was the moment the decision ripened. It wasn't a vote, it was a convergence. The priesthood wanted a spectacle that would teach the city to doubt the evidence of its cooler nights. The nobles wanted the habits of comfort to remain a favor they granted downward. The guilds wanted their margins restored. Arian wanted everyone to stop being afraid of the thing that had made them less powerful and more safe. The queen wanted her teacher left alone. They took the crown from Liana's hair the way one removes a tool from an unlicensed hand. No shouting, no guards. A court lady stepped forward, eyes shiny with a sadness that looked devout and felt expensive, and lifted the gold band as if relieving weight. The coils of Liana's hair fell, ash puffing from them like a small laugh that had forgotten how to be sound. She did not fight. She looked to Saethem. The queen held her gaze with the particular stillness of a woman calculating how to lose so she might protect what's left. "Say something," Arian whispered. He meant a speech that would lace pain into consensus, I think. Liana chose a sentence instead. "Fire does not ask who it warms." Silence moved through the chamber like water finding low ground. The sentence sounded insolent to those who had staked their identities on being warmer than others. It sounded like relief to those who had learned to sit near the vents she'd shaped and share the draft. The council dissolved itself into motions. Titles unstitched. Rooms reassigned. A clerk with a careful hand wrote that Liana would be invited to continue her service in the capacity of artisan advisor, which meant teacher without authority and labor without protection. The priesthood announced 40 days of purification for the palace hearths, which meant incense bought at a markup. I went to her that night with a jar and a mistake. The jar was mine, the one she had given me, the one filled with nothing but remembered dawn. The mistake was advice. "Speak to the markets," I urged. "Show them the numbers. Let the women who bake count aloud how many loaves the new ovens raise. Let the nurses recite how many fevers fell. Make the city listen to its own breath." She shook her head. "They will, but not for me." "Then run," I said. "Come north. Let frost protect what heat cannot." She smiled, the tired smile of someone who knows that leaving is only changing the place where grief finds you. "You taught me to measure outcomes, not intentions," she said. "Look around. The room's still cool. The bread still rises. The infants still wake from their naps not crying. The city has already chosen, it just hasn't admitted it. Systems are slow to confess." In the morning, her chamber was empty. No struggle, no shattered lamp, no trail of golden dust to flatter the poets. The guards swore they had slept. The servants swore they had never seen her that quiet. On the sill, a faint film of ash traced a spiral smaller than a coin. On the floor, a shallow print of a bare foot, half circled by soot, as if she had paused to feel whether the stone still held last night's cool. They searched the cistern tunnels, the shade gardens, the market lanes where her students traded songs for figs. They questioned the clay quarter, then questioned it again. They sealed the palace mouths and starved the fires for a day in pious panic. Nothing. Loss is a teacher with a poor bedside manner. The city went about its business, because bread does not rise on grief. But listen to what business taught. The mirrored bowls worked without her. The breath channels remembered. The shade gardens kept their hours. The doctrine no longer needed a mouth. It's a cruel blessing to have your work survive you so quickly. At dusk on the seventh day, Saethem walked barefoot through the kiln court, hair unbound, feet dusted in ash. She stopped at the mouth of the largest oven, where the air was sweet with cooling bricks, and spoke not to us but to the breath moving through the city. She taught us to share what we cannot own, the queen said. Let that be law. The priests frowned, the nobles counted, the guilds considered. Markets moved, habits hardened. The crown had been taken. The crown had already been copied into 1,000 hands. As for Arian, he learned the particular solitude of men who love women who belong to work larger than marriage. He ruled longer than anyone predicted, softer than some wanted, firmer than rumor recalls. When he spoke of Liana afterward, he did so in the language of outcomes. It was the only language she would have allowed. And me? I returned north with the jar that still held only air and the sentence that still held only truth. The valley asked for a story. I gave them this one, that a servant taught a palace to breathe, and when the palace refused to say thank you, the breath kept moving anyway. Not villains, systems, not miracles, methods, not martyrdom, memory. We never saw her body. We never needed to. Every time a room cools properly in Saethem, every time an oven hums instead of roars, every time a mother marks a lid with a spiral and whispers rest but do not fade, the city repeats her disappearance as a practice rather than a tragedy. That is how collapses heal themselves when they can. By keeping the useful part and letting the part that frightened the powerful vanish into rumor. Fire does not ask who it warms. It only asks whether you've built the mouth wide enough to share. Centuries passed, and the story thinned into rumor the way breath thins at altitude. Then, one summer I will not forget, I stood in a chilled lab in northern Egypt, my palms sweating inside cotton gloves, while a conservator slid a tray toward me as if offering a heartbeat. On the tray lay fragments. Palm fiber, resin dark, edges furred by time. Under raking light the ink rose like low relief. 2 scripts shared a single page, one the desert hand I had learned to trace from temple walls, the other a clipped, stranger script that remembered frost. A spiral appeared in the margin, no wider than my thumbnail. I felt my mouth shape the old instruction before I could stop myself. Rest but do not fade. Coincidence, the senior archaeologist said gently, practicing mercy on my face. But later, alone with the multispectral scans, I saw what training sometimes refuses. A cadence in the strokes. A rhythm that belongs to a hand which has counted nights by firelight. Records suggest the fragments came from a sanctuary near the delta, where wind still tells secrets to broken stone. Contemporary reports described a bilingual household prayer of breath and heat. I call it a message that crossed climates intact. Outside the lab, buses coughed heat into the street. Inside, air purred obediently through ductwork, the faithful animal of modernity. I watched moisture condense on the window and thought of Saethem's shade gardens, cool kept without engines, law written in clay. I also thought of another kind of garden. The humming maze behind any modern building, where unthanked technicians nurse compressors at midnight so strangers can sleep. We still balance survival on the invisible care of a few. Not villains, systems. We admire queens with crowns because they are easy to draw, but the power that endures is almost always granular. In ancient Egypt, the real one whose dust I now carried home in the fibers of my sleeves, women moved that granularity like water. The legal papyri insist on it. Women bought land, signed their names, took lovers, left husbands, inherited shops, sued relatives, adopted heirs, lay claim to wages. Temple records show priestesses overseeing estates the size of towns. The title god's wife of Amun controlled granaries, fields, work crews, processions that rewrote the calendar. When a crisis came, the city listened to women who knew how to keep the course of daily heat and food from breaking. Power measured not in edicts but in continuities. It is tempting to read that as progress and stop there. But the inscription is longer. The same records suggest what we prefer not to see. Much of that power was administrative care. The kind that stabilizes everyone else's risks and is then mistaken for background. When floods misbehaved, women tallied grain. When walls cracked, women hired crews. When a god demanded music, women scheduled the breathing of flutes. It was sovereignty as maintenance. Modern life hides maintenance inside plastic. The old hymns to breath are now thermostat clicks and service tickets. Our shade gardens hum behind access panels. Still, the same questions decide outcomes. Who keeps the temperature survivable? Who pays when comfort is rationed? Who is blamed when the system fails? I keep thinking of energy as a biography of a society's ethics. In Valmir, fire was a commons. In Saethem, heat was abundance that needed discipline. In both, women converted danger to habit. Today we swap wood and sun for gas and watts, but the incentives keep their faces. Utilities prefer predictable bills to efficient homes. Builders cut vents before they cut ribbon. Cities mandate comfort standards and then price them out of reach. We treat warmth like a private virtue instead of a public right, and then congratulate ourselves for charity when the poor choose between food and heat. Meanwhile, entire economies extract profit from manufactured discomfort. Blue flames with new names. When I read headlines about heat waves that turn apartments into kilns, I hear the merchants of Saethem murmuring that fans are luxuries, mirrors unnecessary, shade an indulgence. When I visit a winter shelter and the intake nurse tells me how many frostbitten hands she held this week, I see our valley's pebbles lined again at every door, white for surplus, gray for attention, black for urgency. And I wonder why we still insist on learning triage anew each season. When an engineer shows me a passive cooling school built with local clay and careful breath, and the budget committee calls it experimental, I hear a priest rustle silk and pronounce, with authority, that bone ash glittered. And yet, the good news keeps its own stubborn pulse. In Cairo rooftops retrofitted with lime wash and lattice, I recognize lianas mirrors. In Nubian villages curved like rivers to catch wind, I recognize the mouth 2 hands wide. In women-led cooperatives that teach stove building, in tenant unions that force landlords to insulate, in city codes that reward shade the way they once rewarded height, I recognize the widows at dusk counting notches because accuracy saves lives. These victories are small, local, repetitive, and therefore permanent. Systems trained by repetition do not forget easily. The fragments in the lab were catalogued, translated, argued about, filed. One line, faint but legible, keeps walking circles in my head. Do not waste heat on pride, nor breath on fear. That sentence could have been carved over a Theban doorway or hummed beside my grandmother's hearth. It is not heroic, it is policy. People ask me, sometimes with a smile that forgives me for being earnest, why I care so much about women in old stone. I tell them a story about plumbing. When the city is thirsty, the person who understands pipes outranks the person who understands poems. In ancient Egypt, drought made plumbers of priestesses and accountants of queens. The result looked like holiness because the stakes were mortal. Today the pipes are wires and algorithms, and the holiness hides in dashboards. If you think this is only about air and comfort, look again. It is about who chooses the temperature at which a body can think. It is about whose labor calibrates that temperature and whose name goes on the plaque. It is about incentives that reward heroic rescue while starving the budgets for the quiet, continuous work that makes rescue rare. It is about a sentence Liana spoke in a room designed to shame her. Fire does not ask who it warms. Our institutions still do. When the conservator turned off the raking light, the spiral on the fragment retreated into brown. I handed back the tray and stepped into a noontime that wanted to erase me. The asphalt rippled, the bus shelter flickered, people lined the narrow strip of shade as if queuing for a sacrament. A child reached for the one patch of tempered glass that had not burned his palm. A woman in a sun-faded scarf pulled a compact mirror from her bag and angled the light under the bench so the boy could play on cool concrete. No one thanked her. She did not ask. I walked away carrying nothing but air. It felt like theft and also like permission. I thought of the jar Liana gave me, the one that remembers dawns. That night, in a hotel room that overcooled me into a polite shiver, I opened it and breathed. The air was unremarkable, which is to say faithful. I slept as if watched by a quiet, competent God. The next morning, I wrote a note to myself and taped it to the inside of my notebook where ambition can see it first. Design for steadiness. Reward the maintainers, teach the breath. Then I added the only statistic I trust on this subject. Number of rooms that cooled without anyone noticing, yesterday. I left the line blank and felt the page warm under my palm, as if waiting to be counted. Night comes softly here, and I've learned to meet it halfway. I lowered the lamps, I cracked the window just enough to let the air answer back, and I placed my palm above the radiator as if greeting an old friend. Somewhere, unseen hands keep this room survivable. Somewhere, a woman adjusts a dial, a technician resets a breaker, a planner fights a quiet budget war for insulation over spectacle. I think of them as I finish this story. I think of Mira and Liana, and of queens who measured sovereignty not in gold, but in the steadiness of other people's breath. If you have followed me this far, from frost to sun, from huts to palaces, you already know the secret I promised at the beginning. Power, the kind that lasts, is not thunder. It is maintenance. It is the discipline of warmth. Ancient Egyptian women were more powerful than you think not because they wore crowns, but because they decided how air moved, how grain flowed, how hours aligned, how temples and kitchens kept their necessary temperatures. Their authority was a thermostat disguised as a hymn. I have held papyri and I have held soot, and I trust both. The records tell us women signed contracts, ran estates, held priesthoods that controlled resources and calendars. The soot tells us they managed the continuous conversion of danger into habit, heat into bread, light into learning, ritual into public health. When drought came, they did not ask the Nile to love them more. They measured, diverted, stored, rationed, and sang in time with labor so no one forgot why any of it mattered. Not villains, systems. When I say this aloud in bright rooms, someone always asks for heroes. I understand the hunger. Heroes make good posters. Systems do not. But watch what your life bows to each day. Schedules, flows, thresholds, checks. The hero arrives after the threshold fails. The maintainer keeps it from failing. The queen who made sure the granary stayed cool in midsummer, who audited shade and airflow, who financed a canal instead of another statue. That woman saved more lives than any general. We remember the general because he raised his voice. She never needed to. Fire does not ask who it warms. Liana told a room designed to shame her, and then disappeared so her methods could remain. The line sounds like mercy, but it is also instruction. Build mouths wide enough to share. Mark your lids so memory cannot lie. Hum into the ember at the river's hour. Enforce fairness with rituals that leave no room for favorites. Give the widows the ledger at dusk. Where does that leave us? Here, now, with our vents and tabs and quiet dependencies. With agency, if we want it. Agency is rarely dramatic. It is choosing design over display. It is paying people who keep the temperature steady as if civilization depends on them, because it does. It is writing laws that reward shade, airflow, insulation, passive cooling, district heat, backup for the backup, and redundancies that make boredom possible. It is giving women, especially the ones already doing this work without titles, the budget and the mandate to scale what they know. I have my own small vows. I share them in case you want to borrow warmth, the way we did in Valmir. I will count the rooms that cool without anyone noticing, and thank the hands responsible by name. I will ask for maintainers in every meeting where a vision is pitched. I will praise the dull metrics that save lives and suspect the glossy numbers that flatter. I will teach my students the spiral, the mouth, the ribs. Time turns. Air needs a measured opening. Systems feed from quiet side channels. I will repeat until even the impatient understand that efficiency is a kind of compassion. Sometimes I still dream of the stranger's eyes, ember red, reflecting a fire that could devour as easily as it could feed. I used to fear that gaze. Now I take it as audit. Your warmth was never yours. True, it was given, kept, shared, inherited. Every system that pretends otherwise becomes cruel. Every home that remembers becomes a commons. Look around your room. The light, the hum, the gentle tyranny of comfort. Each is a signature. Whose? If you can name them, do it aloud. If you cannot, repair that anonymity where you can. A note, a raise, a policy, a habit. When the budget comes, ask which line items are gray pebbles and which are black. When the plan comes, ask where the breath will travel and who decides. When the story comes, ask whose maintenance was mistaken for magic and then for nothing at all. You asked for a tale about women more powerful than we think. Here it is, ending as all honest tales do, with work left to do. Take this as a small, persistent blessing. The kind that hums, the kind that can be taught, the kind that scales by imitation. You do not need a throne to practice it. You need a room, a group, a ledger, a willingness to let someone without a title keep the keys. I will leave you with the same ritual I give my own breath when the city sleeps too cold or too hot. Dim the lights. Place your palm near whatever keeps you alive tonight. Say thank you to the hands and minds upstream. Then ask the question a queen would ask before signing anything. Does this choice keep the course steady for those who will never meet me? If yes, sign. If not, hum softly until you feel the ember answer, and try again. The wind outside is quieter now. Somewhere, a compressor turns, a pump sighs, a mirror cools an upstairs room. A mother marks a lid with a spiral and whispers, "Rest but do not fade." I imagine the valley of Valmir exhaling across centuries, the city of Saethem lifting its hair to the night, the long thread of competence running through kitchens, temples, clinics, server rooms, and shade gardens. I imagine you, wherever you are, borrowing this warmth and making it yours by sharing it. Keep the lights low, keep the breath steady, build the mouth wide, not villains, systems, not miracles, methods, not crowns, continuities. Good night.